Welcome to our third session of corporate strategy, which we're going to talk about strategic capability analysis. So in today's lecture, we are looking into first what are classified as resources, what are classified as capabilities, and how these resources transform into capabilities and competencies for the company or organization. And we are doing it through two ways. First, we looking into resource-based view, which is the first thing we need to understand. And this is all the terminology. Some of you might have studied before RBV, resource-based view of the firm. Next, we were looking into value creation within the firm itself to understand a little bit of how value being created at the firm and what exactly does this value get into to the firm. So first, let's look at what are resources here. So we first talk about idiosyncratic resources, and that means it's just a many loose classification and it's a personal choice of classification for resources. And it's very broadly speaking, we can divide resources into general physical resources. That something is tangible, something that you can feel and you can see, and something you can buy and sell. So these are like physical resources that firms own. For example, buildings, equipment, property. If the organization owns the properties, they are tangible and physical resources. Or we can looking into human resources. Human resources are also tangible because firm employs some of these human resources and the firm run by some of these human resources and probably being owned by a few key personnel. These represent the intellectual capital of the firm. Is also capital certain skill sets that the human resources and employees have that may be quite unique in a marketplace, and also these potentially create value for the organization. The third one is organizational resources, which we looking into some sort of man-made things that we're looking into in the organization. So it's not physical, it is not human, but it is things like a structure of the organization, a control system an organization can have, or the way we coordinate things in our organization is in place. Other ways of looking at resources are classifying it according to, for example, assets. Assets are very similar to tangible and physical resources, but some assets can be intangible. For example, reputation, right? Reputation is an asset, and nowadays we can come up with a way to calculating the reputation, so stuff like that. So reputation can be classified as an asset of the company. Likewise, we have other resources that we have, like equipment, facilities, and things the company owns. Other than assets, we have something softer. These are capabilities. Capabilities are things that the organization does that perhaps they're doing it very well, and these capabilities comes from human resources and can come from firms, infrastructure, or organizational resources. So the third one is organization process. It is very much related to organizational resources in the previous slide. The fourth one is firm's attributes. Now, what exactly the firm attributes is some of the conditions that firm possess that's unique and creating some capabilities and some asset. For example, the firm age or the firm's geographic location or the firm's size. These are the attributes that may be treated as a resource and it belongs to the firm. So the other two is information, and also we're looking into knowledge as well. Now we can sort of think whether the firms has the inadequate resources in some areas, or the competitors, or whether the firm possess threshold resources, meaning the resources that needed to stay in a business. Now you might be surprised, and some firms are still struggling to look into basic threshold resources. So maybe in certain business, but they don't own the business, or they don't own the sources of supplies and no control over the raw materials because they don't own it. So you can think about that as this firm is perhaps not having the threshold resources to survive, because if they're producing something and they don't particularly possess or contract control over the factors of the production, then they can question whether the firm has the threshold resources to stay in the business. Now, threshold resources are basic. What is important is the firm must have resources that are rarer and more unique and are needed to for the operation, but may not be easy to have it, or may not be easy to copy from perspective of competitors. Then we're looking into all the resources we mentioned previously. We can further classify it into these three resources that we already mentioned here. So what we done in the previous slide, we're looking into how we can transform the resources into capabilities. Now, what more important here is how we can, and among all those different capabilities of the firm, we need to think about how we can, or whether it is a competence of the organization. Let's put it in a very easy way to understand this way. So all of us are born with two arms, right? So that's a resource. So if all of us have two arms to work on, that's a resource. And using the two arms, we learn how to play, for example, tennis, where we learn how to move our two arms, we learn our capabilities. Because we are making use of our arms for a purpose, right? So that's the capability of using our arms. So that's easy to have the capability. And we use our arms to play tennis. So we all can hold a racket. We can all try to hit the ball, shoot the ball. That sometimes we hit it in 100%, sometimes we hit the balls in 70%, right? So it's okay. So we can all enjoy the playing tennis. But how many of us can become a national tennis player or world-class tennis player? So becoming the national tennis player is a competence. So those people are able to transform and the capabilities of the holding the tennis racket, the capability of hitting the ball and playing the game, into a competence or a good competence of representing the country in tennis, for example. So arms is a resource. The ability to hold a racket and to hit the ball is a capability, and also then the ability to become a world-class tennis player is a competence. So organizations, the reason for the existence is to be able to transform those precious resources. We agree the resources are very precious, right? Because it is rare or very expensive, and we need to make use of the resources if we have them. But what's the point of holding resources if we cannot transform these resources into useful capabilities for the firm, right? So these are very, very important. So again, what's the point, for example, lots of money if we not be able to transform this money into capabilities of the firm, right? So we have lots of knowledge, but we are not able to use this knowledge and transform this capability to transform into capability. So what's the point? So the reason of the organization is to successfully transform the resources or the limited resources they might have, and then into some sort of like whatever resources we are talking, money, time, skill, knowledge, all of this here, as much as this into capability. And for those that we cannot transform, the question is, are these resources there? So these are very, very important, and to be able to maintain those. Is it possible? Critical success factors in many textbooks and many things that read or journals may refer to what we call them the organizational capability. So it's very different from key success factor we learned in the last session. So that's very important that we understand those differences, right? So it's link between resources and the competitive environment element of the product or service that customers value use to distinguish between provider schools list. For example, John Kay says in the Foundation of Corporate Success, some of these resources leading to distinctive capabilities or competency, and classify resources in terms of histories in three key areas: architecture, reputation, and then the company's ability to innovate. So, and he used the term distinctive capabilities or competencies. Now let's move to the term we call a resource-based view of the firm. Professor J. Bunny, he talked about the resource-based view of the firm. And his argument says that basically the resources are great, resources are fantastic, but we need to find out what are the resources that give the firm a sustainable competitive advantage or sustained competitive advantage. So he made use of the term competitive advantage quite different from Michael Porter, and we use the term competitive advantage to refer to something different coming from the external environment as well. Here, J. Bunny, Professor J. Bunny, used the resource as a point of entry for a sustained competitive advantage. So in Barney's works, a sustained competitive advantage comes from organization, and it comes from the resources of the organization. He defined resources as any asset, capabilities, organizational processes, firm attribute, information, knowledge that controlled by a firm. So these are resources. And also he mentioned that the firm can have competitive advantage when it is able to implement a value creating strategy that is not simultaneously being used and implemented by any competitors. And if we become a sustained competitive advantage when the competitors are not able to duplicate or benefit from these strategies. So Professor Barney, looking into some sort of flaws in a strictly environmental model. Well, basically he criticized this environmental model of the Michael Porter's, so that the book tried to lay stick on the competitive advantage and history of the term competitive advantage, where other authors and professors tried to use competitive advantage didn't do that well as these two professors that we know. But Professor Barney tried to say competitive advantage come from the firm's resources. Use that argument to criticize that the environmental model of Michael Porter has few flaws in it. So the flaws are, for example, if all firms have the same resources, then they all have the same strategically relevant capital. So basically, in the earlier argument, the key success factor, if you remember we touched base, comes from the environment. And everybody who is in environment is able to assess the resource. For example, the fishbowl or anything, or anybody can access to the resource that might be accessible to anybody. But the other flaw is first mover advantage is not conceivable. And also the third one, looking into barriers to entries are not conceivable as well. So other than criticizing the environmental models, J. Barney says that in order for a company to create sustained competitive advantage, they have to looking at the resource, and they have to evaluate the resources based of these two attributes or conditions. The first one, the particular resources must be valuable, and the second one, it has to be rare in origin. Also, it has to be imperfectly imitable, and the last one, it does not have any substitute, no alternative. But for this theory to be true, this is a critique to this theory. For this theory to be true, then these conditions have to be met. The resource is not homogeneous, it's heterogeneous, meaning everybody cannot have access to it. And some people can, some people do not have access to it. So It's not homogeneous, it's heterogeneous. And resource cannot move. Here we call it immobile. So let's say, for example, you have a marketing director in a company that are doing a great work, and you say, well, this marketing director is a resource and is a distinctive competency of my company. What do you think? Is it true or is not true? Right, so these are the questions that we need to ask and say, okay, why are we asking these questions? So very important to be able to answer that. So these are the questions. So in summary, what is resource-based view? And that is why we have employment clauses. So to say, oh well, some marketing directors, when they leave the companies, they cannot join the competitors for the next 2 years. So exactly, so this is a clause, but again, this is a different approach, but there are of course other positive approaches or approach that the marketing director, like a huge bonuses to keep him and stuff if they are really doing well. So coming back to the slide, that basically in order for something to comply, we have resource-based view. So it needs to meet the 4 conditions, and valuable, rare, imperfect, imitable, and non-substitute. So, and also plus that, the 2 underlying assumptions that we looking into heterogeneity and also immobility. These are just, of course, the assumption, and we know that in real life it's very hard to look into it or something unless it's really is a mountain or something happens that it's become immobile. So these are the things. So these help us to reach the sustained competitive advantage. So the next key topic of this session is about value creation. We always need to looking into capability of the companies to add creating value. So we need to looking at value of outputs that or value of the firm's outputs measured by the revenue must be greater than the cost of input like labors, materials, capitals, all the direct costs, right, of the company. However, in value-added concept, it is not the same as accounting profit. We need to know, because adding value is a slightly different concept of the accounting profit. We're looking into this concept of value surplus. So the final sales of the product is based on 2 things. One is the purchase plus the value added, the activities of the companies that add some value or due to the employees or the money they expend on the shop floor of the product to some sort of create the values surplus and to add it to basically reflect both the cost as well as the value added component to the activity of the company. The concept of value surplus is expressed into the value chain developed by Michael Porter. He basically classified the company divided into different functions or different departments doing different activities. For example, as a primary activity, so part of the company is doing the procurement, responsible to bring the material, or we call it inbound logistics. And then we have operations to produce something, then the distribution from the outbound logistics, and then marketing and sales, and then it comes to after sales. This represents the primary activities of the organization. And then we have other departments along the way, for example, firm infrastructures, human resource management, technology development, and procurement, which are the supporting activities throughout the entire primary activities throughout this the product reach out to the company, to the customers. And these are all represent the surplus or the value added that we reach to. You can see that the margin at the end and the final revenue. So hopefully everybody contributes to creating the margin for the organization. Now this diagram perhaps explaining better as to what is classified as, for example, firm infrastructure activity, what is human resource activity, what are the technology development activity, what is the procurement activities. And then when we come to the primary activities like inbound logistics or looking into operations, outbound logistics, sales and marketing, sales and services, you can see all these activities under each of those activities that in general they're all batting alleys and then looking into the margin. In strategy, in what we are also encouraging, we always think to use the value chain to think about activities in various pockets that support the corporate level strategy. For example, if you want the corporate level strategy to come to low cost leadership area, then every activity need to basically follow that concept in the value chain especially, or support this low cost leadership. For example, in a primary activity, instead of having a smaller shipments, you can go for economies of scale by having a larger shipments or massive warehouse. For example, instead of sending things, we also try to do it in a bulk or large quantity. So these are some good examples here. Another example, if the organization strategy is looking into differentiation, right? So then we need to make sure every activity in the organization, either primary or support, aim or direct the strategy intent, like a differentiation. For example, in operation, rather than focusing on mass production, we're focusing on the ability of the company to improve on its quality, to have products that are very different and unique. In terms of, for example, in the marketing and sales is a distinctive advertisement to show that this product is, that is just a mass product marketing. So from a strategic viewpoint, losing the value chain is very different at the operational point. A strategic viewpoint, we aim to pull together these different pockets of activities so that they contribute to the organizational mission in a concerted manner, right? Rather just each department doing just their own special things that bring the organization in different direction. So we can conclude today's session to looking into this following thoughts. Value chain is a powerful concept if you know how to apply. And of course, as we have illustrated, maybe you have learned this concept in other classes, but what you have learned, it might be slightly different from what we learned. You might use the value chain to understand how the operation link together. But in this subject, we're learning to be using value change to make sure how different pockets of activities contribute to value surplus of the organization. And we can even find a way to quantify and calculate basically how to calculate the value surplus and what the organization does in activity-based costings as well. It's kind of management accounting costing. So the value chain may reveal problem but does not help with the solution. And lastly, need to consider value chain for the industry. Now we reached the end of our session today, where we cover a couple of different very interesting topics. Thank you very much and all the best.